This is NEGOTIATEx Podcast, show number 115. Hello, welcome to the NEGOTIATEx Podcast. My name is Nolan Martin. Joining me today, Aram and Aram, do you want to kick it off for today?
I will, Nolan. Thank you so much. Folks, today we're joined by Chris Wong, father of two, podcast host, and business owner who lives outside Boston, Massachusetts. He has worked in the nonprofit and healthcare sector for more than 15 years. Chris began his career working as a licensed therapist and transitioned into learning and development. He also built a leadership and organizational department from the ground up, including formal mentorship and leadership development programs, and led organizational projects. Chris founded Leadership Potential, where he partners with new nonprofit executives to navigate chaotic transitions and create high-performing cultures to get things done. This involves working with nonprofit leaders around executing strategic plans, as well as addressing challenges such as conflict resolution, culture enhancement, board engagement, building influence, and fostering inclusive work environments. Chris serves on the board of a foundation and the board of a nonprofit, and also co-hosts the podcast, The Art and Science of Difficult Conversations, where he helps people master difficult conversations in all domains of their lives. Chris, thanks so much for joining us on the NEGOTIATEx Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor for me to be here.
Well, Chris, your work spans executive coaching, therapy, nonprofit strategy. What initially drew you to the intersection of leadership development and difficult conversations?
I originally got started as a licensed therapist, so that's where I got my just that comfort in doing the difficult conversations. But I got burned out, and so I had to transition to learning and development because I still wanted to be in the space. I still wanted to help people transform and grow in whatever way possible. And if anybody listening is a learning and development professional, one of the things that haunts us forever is how do we get people to keep learning outside of these training events? And my research just took me to understanding that leadership was really where it was at, because the leaders are the people with the staff every day, coaching, mentoring, setting policy, setting culture. And so that's what led me to start doing more leadership development work. And I was surprised. I didn't realize it because when I first got into it, I was just hoping to build skill sets. I didn't realize how much of it was also they have to have difficult conversations in all aspects with their employees, up, across, outside, if they're working with external vendors or external sources. And I was surprised because I thought it was like a whole new skill set that like would be out of reach for me because I wasn't doing that particular work. But the more I learned about it, the more I dove into it and was training and coaching others, I was like, oh, I know all this stuff already. I just now have to adapt it to new language to help everybody. And then it just took off from there.
I love the focus on leadership. Nolan and I do corporate trainings as well. I always wonder how much of this will stick, how much will get applied going forward. Always a challenge. You mentioned your own burnout. As you coach people today, how much burnout do you see out there amongst the people that you're engaged with?
I think I see it a lot still. I think everybody sees it. That's why there's a lot of burnout coaches or mindfulness coaches out there. I still do therapy part-time at my private practice, and I still see it. People are burned out. They're stressed. They're anxious. They're not sleeping well. So all aspects, I see it everywhere, I think, because people are just, especially after COVID, people are just pushing themselves to the brink. We haven't really recovered, but we're still having to push forward, right? Like, especially if you had kids, you're still doing the work, you're still managing all these things, you're still holding a huge emotional load and a cognitive load, and you still got to push forward somehow. So a lot of it is how do you find your passion?
Yeah, and I have to think that impacts, we're going to get into difficult conversations. I got to think that impacts the way in which we engage with each other.
Yeah, people are stressed. I think people are just have less of a patience to sit through that difficult conversation. I think when a lot of people come to my trainings or I do webinars or talk to people, they're always looking for they don't say it this way, but what are the magical phrases I need to say to get people to do what I want them to do? And it doesn't work like that. There's no magical set of phrases that'll make people suddenly happy to get a warning or get fired.
Well, darn, why'd we have you on then, Chris? I thought you were going to give us some magic tricks.
Yeah, it's just a lot of it is really just people are stressed already going into it. So their mindset is, I just need to get through this. And so they try to avoid it or they do it incorrectly going into it.
Well, Chris, the statistic that 57% of people would do almost anything to avoid a difficult conversation is striking. What do you think drives this avoidance?
I always teach there's a few different things that always come up. It's number one, they're invested in the outcome and the relationship. So they want an outcome specifically that they want, but also they want to do it in a way that maintains a positive working relationship. They don't want to be best friends with them, but they want to at least have a healthy working relationship. The second thing is they're just that idea of fight, flight, or freeze. We're all human. We have that. If we see it as a threat, we're going to be in that fight, flight, or freeze. And the hard part about it is it's not just us, but the other person in the conversation is also experiencing it. So when we think about people who are yelling at us or lying or not responding or just shutting down, it's just that fight, flight, or freeze response. They just don't know how to respond, and they're just reacting emotionally and instinctively. So it's really about how do you manage yourself and then manage somebody else's fight, flight, or freeze response. And the third thing is that they just don't know what to say. They might be super comfortable with it. They might know have all the confidence in the world. They might be super emotionally intelligent and know how to manage themselves and the other person. They might just not know the words to say that can move the conversation forward or get closer to the outcome that they're looking for, and so they feel stuck. And so it could be any of all three of those or any combination of those three.
Yeah, I like the fight, flight, or freeze and trying to manage someone else's. You typically don't think of the other person. You typically just think of yourself. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
You emphasize that in managing difficult conversations, when this is done well, we can actually transform stress into a stronger relationship. Can you share a moment where you actually witnessed this transformation in action?
Yeah, I have two. I was thinking about this as, during COVID, I was the chair of a board, and one of the members was just being unprofessional. And him and I will always disagree whether he was actually being unprofessional. But the reality is it was going against the way our code of conduct. And so I had to talk to him about it, and he disagreed, and we had lots of conversations. I said, and eventually he had to step down from the board. But throughout the conversation, the more I dug into it, the more we disagreed, more it was clear that he was also just going through some stuff. And he was able to share that he was also feeling in a dark place. He was starting to feel suicidal. And so that became a precedent. Like, I wouldn't have discovered that if I hadn't dug into the conversation, if I wasn't willing to engage in that. He wouldn't have shared with us. And then there could have been, safety concerns outside of even recognizing that. But the fact that he was able to share, we hadn't talked about that kind of stuff before, but by being able to dig deep into it, I was able to get to a place where he trusted me with that information. So that's one. And another one was just recently. I was coaching this director who was having a lot of stress with this other chief of staff or this other person from another department that kept giving him lots of these tasks that weren't given any context, so he would drop everything he was doing because it came from the COO. He ended up pushing back a lot of his own tasks and not getting stuff done. And then he would do these tasks, but nothing would happen with it. Like, he would get these reports or do these things. He ended up swearing in a meeting at her because he was so frustrated. And so I had to coach him through, how do you fix this relationship and how do you have that conversation with her so that you're able to work better? And it was just one conversation, and it completely transformed the way they worked together, because he was able to then coach her to think about how do you manage up and coach your own manager. So they had a good working relationship, but it got even better because he was able to work with her and figure out how to work better and collaborate.
Yeah, what strikes me is that in both of those examples, as the communication improved, I know we're going to get into skills in a moment, and the trust improves, it sounds like they start to solve the problem that's really underneath what was on the surface, which suggests maybe we're going to deal with the substantive, you called kind of the outcome focus. We're going to be able to deal with it a little better too as we strengthen the relationship.
Absolutely. I think it's, in negotiation, they call it interest-based negotiation, right? The idea that you're trying to see underneath the surface. And I always think about that in all of difficult conversations. There's something going on underneath the surface, and the better you can identify it and bring it out into the open, the better you both can figure out what's really blocking forward progress and then get to that outcome that you're both looking for.
Absolutely. The interesting thing there is, you had mentioned interest-based negotiations. It's crazy to think about how having a interest-based negotiation discussion can mimic a difficult conversation or have the same kind of things that impact that conversation. So it's pretty interesting how they're both connected. Difficult conversations happen at every level of an organization. Do the skills required to navigate them differ from frontline managers versus senior executives? If so, how? And if not, what are the critical skills we need to master?
I think they do, and I think there's always going to be minor things depending on kind of the level. I think the biggest, most clearest difference between any level is the power dynamic. And I think that's something that's often missed in these kind of conversations. And it's not just the positional power, right? Because that makes a difference, right? If you're the CEO talking to frontline supervisor, yes, there's a huge power disparity there. And I would also argue there's lots of other power dynamics at play, under the surface things, right? Like age, gender, cultural norms, all those things play a role. So even if I'm CEO, if I'm a whiz kid and I'm a 25-year-old CEO, but I'm talking to a frontline supervisor that's been in the field for 40 years and he's a white male, even though I have a positional power, I'm going to feel like that person has other power in the dynamic. And so my goal in anything is like thinking about how do I navigate that power difference? How do I even the playing field as much as possible in a way that's honoring and respecting, right? I'm not trying to disrespect anybody, but if it's somebody that is lower power in any domain, how do I empower them so that they feel more equal part of the conversation? And if they have more power in the conversation, whether by position or by other factors, how do I phrase the conversation so that I'm seen as an equal, so that I'm seen on an equal playing field and being willing to push back or whatever it may be? So I think that's the biggest thing, is how do I navigate that conversation so that we can equal the power dynamics a lot.
And let's dig into that a little bit more. Like, what tips do you have for people? Because I was a young lieutenant, so a platoon leader, and my partner is a platoon sergeant who has 15 more years experience than I do. And I'm coming in there and I have to have this dynamic. And so really interested in the tips that you have for doing this.
I would say if you are in higher power, if you have more power in that dynamic or that relationship, starting off with thanking the other person for being in the conversation in the first place, that's a huge equalizer, because that's empowering them. That it's just a subtle hint that they have power to choose to be in that relationship or that conversation. And then also asking permission. Is it okay if we do this? Is it okay if we move on in the conversation? I always teach it in terms of like any difficult conversation has an agenda, not necessarily the content, but really just there's an intro, there's ground rules, then there's the flow of the rest of the conversation. The more you can ask permission between different agenda items, the more you're empowering the other person to be part of the conversation. And so that's ways you can empower them. If you're on the lower level, let's say you're a lower and you're trying to reach up, you can still do those things. I think those things are still good. And I think it's also about how do you set ground rules as well. So if you set ground rules and say, if things get heated, if things start getting out of control, I want us both to be able to say, let's take a break or stop if need be. Right. So the more you can set the ground rules at the beginning, that can also raise you. And the more you can say we, as opposed to I did this or you need to do this, the more we can say we, the more you're collaborating and putting yourself on an equal footing with that person. So I think those are big things I always teach, because I think they're subtle ways to just change, to even the playing field and the dynamics. Soliciting
their buy-in is just seems like it's so critical and a key to success here. So thank you.
And I just want to point out that, Chris, twice you started with how do I, as the person with more power or leadership, kind of empower the person that's junior or beneath me or whatever. I love that you did that first. I think a lot of times we jump to how do I equalize myself or put myself on equal power with somebody who's senior to me. I was reading my kids a quote the other day by John Quincy Adams, and it says, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. And I feel like you just demonstrated that in spades. So thanks for that. I think we do have to start from a place of how do we empower and give others voice and give them that place at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the leader's job, right? Is how do we empower? How do we inspire, motivate?
You teach strategic empathy as a tool for handling difficult behaviors. What are the biggest misconceptions that people have about empathy in high-stress conversations?
I think the question I get the most is, how do I balance being empathetic or caring and then holding people accountable? And I think too many times people put them on opposite sides of the spectrum, like you can't be assertive or you can't be holding people accountable if you're empathetic. It's really the same thing. I think that's the biggest misconception, is that there are even opposites. Empathy doesn't mean you're letting people get away with things. It doesn't mean that you're letting people walk all over you or you don't set your own boundaries. Empathy just means that you understand other people's emotions or worldview and understand why they might be doing that. Right? Like when I was doing therapy, the first time I was doing therapy, I was working with sex offending behaviors. I could certainly understand a lot of them came from traumatized backgrounds, heavy developmental and childhood trauma. I could certainly understand why they're doing these kind of things, right? It doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't mean I'm going to let them keep doing whatever they're doing, right? We still have to move towards a better behavior, more towards a better code of conduct or outcome, right? So empathy is just understanding and recognizing that there's a lot of other factors at play. So somebody who's stressful or their performance is slacking, it means that you might understand, their performance is slacking because they got a lot of family stuff going on. They got a parent in hospice care. They had to take a detour. Their kids' childcare shut down, so now they have to find a new care situation. So now they're juggling all these things. That's great. And they still need to get work done. You're still paying them to get work done, right? So how do you balance those things? How do you help them balance all these different things? And the more you can do that, the more you can be seen as caring, empathic, and then they'll trust you, the person you're talking to will trust you. Like, okay, I know that you got my best interests at heart. I know you're not trying to cut me out. You're just trying to help me out. So let's work together. So you're getting that buy-in also.
As you're talking, I'm wondering, do we need to be empathetic with ourselves too? And I guess what I'm thinking of, Chris, is absolutely I need to empathize with others. Can I do that if I'm not connected to my own self? And I'm thinking of how incredibly difficult it is during an emotionally charged conversation to stay calm. And when you're talking fight or flight or freeze, it's not typically my initial response. Does empathy play a role in the first step to regaining self-control when a discussion starts going off track?
Yeah, you make a great point. I think it's about setting those boundaries and being aware of our own values and honoring our own values and boundaries. You know, we interviewed somebody on our podcast a few weeks ago and she does a lot around like mindset and boundaries. And she made a really good point that boundaries are for ourselves. They're just our values. They're what help keep us emotionally stable. They're not about other people. Other people those are barriers. Those are things that you don't want them to do, but you can't control that, right? You can't control whether somebody's going to get angry or if they'll say something that's offensive to you. The best we can do is say, this is the boundary for myself. If somebody says something offensive, I need to cut it off because I need to take care of myself. And that's caring. You're right. That's empathy for ourselves. And that's okay. And everybody's boundaries are different, right? Like if I'm in a difficult conversation, somebody's yelling at me or they're swearing at me, I know myself well enough that I'm going to be okay. I don't need to take a break because I know that I can manage that and I'm not going to get offended by that. But other people do. They need to take that break, and that's okay. Everybody's boundaries are different. That's that self-empathy you were talking about.
You got to ask one on a follow on this. Just saw this recently, which talked about sometimes when you establish boundaries, people take that as judgment as a judgment, you know, and the response is, who are you to judge me? And I'm not judging, I'm establishing boundaries. Any thoughts on this kind of, as I establish boundaries so that I can show up the best version of myself in this conversation to prevent that from sounding to you as I'm judging some sort of, behavior or my interpretation of something from you?
I think that's part of it. How do you set that boundary is being concrete. Just like I very consider it's similar to giving feedback. It's the more concrete you can be as opposed to assigning like a judgment or an assumption of why somebody's doing something, the easier it is to set that boundary of if you're yelling, if I'm yelling, if we're yelling in this conversation, I want to take a break. If that's okay with you, I need to take a break. I want us to be able to be calm. It's not assigning any assumption of why that person might be yelling or why I might be yelling. It's just this behavior is, I don't like this behavior. And also just recognizing or making peace with the fact that you can't control how people will receive things. You know, you could say it in the most kind, thoughtful way. People are going through their own things, and it's okay to recognize that and say, listen, I get it. It doesn't sound great to you. This is just a boundary I need to set for myself. So it's making peace with that. Like, people will feel how they feel, and that's okay.
I love that. Moving on to preparation here. Aram and I are big fans of preparation with our military background, and we know that you also emphasize preparation as a key to handling difficult conversations well. What are the 3 most critical things leaders should do before entering a potentially high-stress discussion?
They need to think about the outcome, number 1. What is the goal they're trying to achieve? And I think that's probably the most misunderstood thing going into any difficult conversation. Because everybody, I think, conflates multiple goals into one big goal. And they also conflate venting as a goal, right? I want to yell at you. I want to express my frustration. That's not a goal. Or that is a goal, but that you can't then change somebody's mind because of that, right? I think clarity on that goal is number 1 is I want them to behave a different way, or I want them to look at things a different way. I just want to yell at you because I'm just frustrated at you. Again, you can't combine those goals, right, all the time, because I don't know anybody that gets yelled at and says, you know what, you're right, I need to change my mind about something.
It doesn't even work with kids, does it, Chris?
Doesn't work with kids, right? So, you know, I think everybody sees all these gotcha moments on Reels or Shorts or TikTok about like these political conversations. And like, yeah, I guess they're great. Like if you're on their side, like it feels great. Like in your brain, it just feels good to have that gotcha moment. Like I got one over on you. But is that really going to change their minds? No, not at all. If you want to change their mind, that influence, that persuasion, that takes a different conversation of let's explore, let's sit down and think about this and talk through it. So number 1 is the goal. Number 2 is thinking about your mindset going into it. What are you thinking about going into the conversation? Because in therapy, there's a philosophy of cognitive behavioral therapy of our thoughts influence our feelings and behaviors. So if we go into the conversation thinking that it's going to be a fight, thinking that the other person is difficult or the other person's a bad person, that's going to influence our emotions going into it. We're automatically going to view everything through that lens. and we're going to behave accordingly. So, the client that I was coaching that I mentioned, after we were talking, he realized, oh, I was going into the conversation already expecting her to give me bad news. So he was already primed to be upset and angry. He was like psyching himself up, like, I'm going to be upset at this. And so we talked about it. A better mindset from going into it was, I just need to be curious. I just need to be open and figuring out, what is this person going to say, and why might they be saying this information? And like, that was the biggest change for him. Like, I didn't really do much in terms of like how he would phrase the conversation, just really, what am I thinking going into this? And from there, he was able to take it and go and just say, okay, why is she asking me to do this task? And then he was able to explore with her what to do going forward. So it made a big difference that way. And then the third thing, I think, is just thinking through kind of what you're going to say. There's so much that can be said about the opening, how you open it, how you phrase everything. And I think it's important to draw up, what are you going to say? How are you going to say it? Practicing it out loud so you know how it sounds and whether the wording needs to be different based upon who the other person is and your understanding of them.
We have this saying in the military that no plan survives first contact, but we go through this very in-depth planning process, and most likely it's not going to go how we intend, but it helps us be able to figure it out on the fly because we at least thought through different ideas or different things. So I'm assuming that same kind of mentality is effective here.
Yeah, I use a Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
Perfect.
So you talked about practice. I'm curious, do you encourage a rehearsal or a role play before having this or not? Does that reinforce a negative framing of what might happen, or does it actually help you find those words that might be helpful?
I do suggest the more contentious you think it'll be, or the more high stakes you think it's going to be, I do suggest a role play or practice, whatever you want to call it. But you got to practice it. Because I think when you say words out loud, your brain processes it differently than when you just think about the words. And so you need to hear them out loud because you need to hear the phrasing. Every time I do a hard conversation that's going to be high stakes, or a phone call where I know I'm leaving a voicemail message, anything, or a webinar or a presentation, I will walk around my house just saying everything out loud because I need to hear it. Does it sound right? And I'll edit it lots of times. I actually encourage a very focused practice. I never say, let's practice the entire conversation. I always say number one, before we even get into it, the first minute or two, just vent. Say what you really are thinking about the other person. If you're angry at them or whatever, vent, yell at them, curse at them, swear. And I've found that first 1 or 2 minutes really is a great pressure relief. It gets all that stuff out of their head, and then they don't have to feel that way. They don't have to feel like they're holding it back. Any more than 2 minutes, I find then they're just venting and they just start amping themselves up even more. But 1 or 2 minutes is fine. When we role play, just do a couple minutes at a time, right? Because then you can really go back and say, what did I do in this part that worked? What do I want to switch? And then we move on. But I feel like breaking it up, just like I use football analogies a lot, right? Like throughout the week, they're not practicing the entire game. They're practicing very specific plays throughout it. And then they'll do a walkthrough at the end, but they're doing very specific plays every single time because they need to practice this specific routine or walkthrough.
I love that. What I think we've noticed is when people over prepare, where they're trying to memorize everything that they're going to say, then nothing lands because they aren't listening. They aren't actually taking into account the conversation that's happening. So
yeah, it feels like there's this balance between being well prepared, but also trying to be natural. I was thinking about, as you're talking, Chris, I'm thinking about the voicemail example. I don't know why that one always catches me off guard, but I'm never ready to leave a voicemail. Every time I leave a message with someone, I butcher it. It never says what I was trying to say.
That's right.
My wife always hears me when I do that. It's like, what did you just say? That's not at all what we talked about. I'm like, oh, sorry. I cracked under pressure.
On preparation, one more thing. Everything you mentioned, thinking about what your goals are, thinking about, the mindset that I'm carrying in here, thinking about the first words I might speak. How important is it in preparation to take some time and just consider where the other person is, whether it's on the issue or it's where they're emotionally? Do you do any of that?
Yeah, that's part of it too. Like that's part of one of the things I would also do is, I have a whole workflow figuring out what's their communication style, what's their processing style. For instance, one of the things that catches people is like, are they an internal processor or an external processor? So external processor is like me. I need to talk things out to think out loud. If you have somebody like that, it may sound like they're disagreeing with you at first, but really they're just thinking through the process. Their gears are turning out loud in their head versus like an internal processor where they need to think through it. It may feel like they're disengaged. It may feel like they're not listening to you, but they are. They're really just thinking through it in their head, all the stuff that's going on. If you're the same style, then it makes it easier. You understand what's happening right away intuitively. But if you're the opposite style, then you're going to misinterpret their behavior. And so it's really thinking through what is their communication style. And if you want to persuade them of something, what's their motivation? What's their interest here? What's something they need? Or how are they viewing the situation? How am I contributing to this conflict or this situation? And how are they contributing? And how flexible can I be in this to show them that I'm part of the process?
A key part of preparation, and certainly being able to get into someone else's shoes, is being able to get insights from another person, sometimes a colleague, maybe somebody senior to us. You've built leadership and organizational development programs from the ground up, including formal mentorship initiatives. As we think about mentorship, in your experience, what makes a mentorship program truly effective?
I've seen lots of different styles of mentorship. I think it's preparing the mentors and the mentees for what to expect out of the process. I think the training at the beginning is so helpful. And it sounds weird, like you have to train to be a mentor or mentee, but it's helpful to just have structure around what that process looks like. And I've talked to lots of senior leaders who are more than happy to be a mentor. And the first thing they say to me, yes, I'd be more than happy to be a mentor, but I don't really know how to be a mentor or what to do or what to say. I say, I got you, don't worry. And so we just go through a process of like, this is what it looks like to be a mentor. This is how you guide the conversation. This is how you give feedback. It's not a very long process. It's like a 2-hour training or just orientation, you can call it that. But it's helpful to just get that for both sides. So the mentees know what to expect out of the conversation, what goals to bring in, how to ask questions. And the more you can just provide structure for them, that's helpful. You don't have to, I've found success in, you don't have to structure every single meeting or how many times they meet or what that looks like. That should be up to them. But them knowing how to do the process is invaluable.
In your sense, is it equal responsibility for mentor and mentee in that relationship to kind of achieve the aims of that mentorship? Or does more fall on the mentee to drive some of the things you're sharing there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think philosophically, I think it's just equal. It's an equal relationship. I think there are some things that the mentee should drive more, like they should be driving a lot of the process, the priorities, and things like that. But the mentor should also be part of driving the process in terms of following up, being responsive, giving appropriate feedback, making introductions, and also just making sure that if the mentee is not following up on certain things, the mentor should feel empowered to say, last time I assigned you this book or I gave you this book to read and you said you would, you still haven't done it, like 3 months have passed now, what's getting in the way here? Like the mentor should feel empowered to also follow up and check in and hold people accountable to the process.
And can a mentor be somebody who's in our direct kind of chain of command, our food chain, or is it better when that's someone off and maybe offers a different perspective?
That's a good question. I was trying to think back to the research I did when I first started. I think it doesn't matter if it's the same role. I think it really more matters what the mentee's goals are, right? If the mentee's goals are something like in their line, like, if it's the first time they just got into the workforce and they want to be VP of operations and or COO, so it just happens to be in their line, then it makes sense for their mentor to be somebody in that role. Like it's really more what's the mentee's goals and experiences and where does it line up and match up the most.
Are there unique challenges that nonprofit leaders face when it comes to difficult conversations with boards, donors, and staff? And what negotiation or conflict resolution strategies do you find most valuable for nonprofit executives?
I think that they think their situations are very unique. I find that across every industry that I've ever worked in. Maybe you find this too, is every industry says, nobody understands our work. I need to work with somebody that's done our specific job and role in life. And, people problems are people problems, right? Somebody doesn't want to do work. And I had a friend that was in the Air Force, and he also had struggled with somebody not doing their work correctly or appropriately, right? And I'm sure you've run into that too. Like everywhere, it's hard to motivate people. You need to just figure out what motivates them. And then people just have their own stuff they bring into the work. And so I think nonprofit leaders think their situations are different. And certainly the context of how they do the work is different, but the people problems are still the same. How do you get people engaged? Whether they're employees or volunteers, I actually found that to be very similar too. I thought it would be different as well when I first started. I thought, because volunteers aren't paid, it takes a little bit different. But I find that it's actually very similar conversations. If you have a good, engaged, and thriving culture among volunteers, they're going to work just as hard as your employees. And likewise, even employees, you pay them, they could still just not be doing the work correctly or slacking off or not wanting to do the job. So it's still the same. And so it's really about how do you connect with people? How do you motivate people? How do you collaborate? How do you create an environment where they trust you, you have that credibility, and you trust them? And that's all the same as how do you deal with people.
I love that.
Nolan, it reminds me of when we'll go in and do a session, and it could be with a group of Navy SEALs, it could be a group of MBA students, it could be a group of nonprofit executives, and you ask them, who do you have these difficult conversations or negotiations with over what sorts of things and what makes them challenging? The who and the what, that context-specific stuff that Chris, that you're talking about, might be different, right? It might be nuanced to your industry. But what you said, people problems are people problems, right? It still comes down to perceptions and different goals and personalities and sometimes, physical constraints and resources, right? And oftentimes those deal with people again, right? Past histories, relationships, all those things seem to be somewhat universal.
It goes on to and I mentioned this before, but a supplier and vendor relationship where they're like, oh, the supplier has all the power. No, the vendor has all the power because they're a sole source supplier. It's always the other person has all the power. They're both in the same situation and they both don't think that they're in power. So, yeah.
So, Chris, I'd love, if possible, to ask you a few very specific situations and maybe get your advice on how what we've been discussing kind of applies in these contexts. So, first of all, how about when you're dealing with a truly difficult person? We often like to say, it's easy to assume someone is crazy, evil, stupid, and we know those people do exist. They're not frequently the people we're talking to, though. But in cases, there are truly difficult people. They're defensive, they're dismissive, misleading, they're aggressive. How do you apply this with someone like that?
Yeah, so part of it is thinking about the ground rules. As I said at the beginning, is thinking about you saying the ground rules of being able to be honest or stay calm or whatever. And it's not that they will always prevent all those types of behaviors. It's that you have more ammunition to pull back to, saying, hey, you agreed to this structure at the beginning, and you can start exploring from there what's going on for them. And part of that is personality difference. Like if you feel comfortable in conflict or in intense emotions, then it's really about reflecting, asking about what's going on, spending time in those emotions or that behavior and trying to dig deep what's driving that behavior and bringing it out into the open, as we talked about earlier. And so that's what I would always recommend. If you feel comfortable, explore, figure out what's going on. If you're not, if you need to take a break, if that's a boundary for you, put it in your ground rules. Say, if things get out of hand, if we start getting disrespectful towards one another, let's just take a break. Let's come back, because I know that it's a hard conversation for both of us. So let's come back to it. But yeah, I think it's also just thinking about what's your own personal style and your personality.
How about shifting to a different scenario? Conversations regarding organizational change, particularly change that feels overwhelming for most everyone that's involved. Perhaps it's a leadership or it's a policy change or it's addressing problems with the current company culture.
Yeah, so that's a big question, because I think that depends. That's a very broad question in terms of who you're talking to and then what stage of the change you're in. Because when I'm talking to leaders, I'm recommending that from the beginning, before you even start the change, you should be already transparent about what's going on and doing that storytelling so that people can start thinking about, oh, there is a need to change. Otherwise, if they don't see a need to change, then of course they're just going to keep fighting it, right? But if they see the need to change, then they're going to be more empowered to think about it. And then you can facilitate that conversation of what does that change look like for you? What are your concerns? How could that look? And then you're just guiding them through that process. But if they're fighting you on that every step of the way, there's no substitute for you have to sit down and think about how to guide that conversation with them one-on-one. What's getting in the way? What's worrying about you? Figuring out, is it a resource issue? Is it a concern about their own talent or skill in the next phase of that, what that future looks like? Or are they worried about their job? Because, I think especially as we think about AI or more technology, people are going to be worried about their jobs. Or if there's lots of layoffs, people are worried about their jobs, and there's things you can't control. There's things you can't stop from happening. So it's thinking about what do they need to feel supported in that situation, in that moment, and what resources or people do they need. There's no substitute for that one-on-one conversation as much as possible.
Thanks. Organizational change, and obviously we look nationally, there's a lot of change occurring right now, and it really does create a lot of instability for people and how people respond. I like how you framed that. I don't know if the next situation is any simpler than that, because I always feel like organizational change is one of the most difficult things we as leaders have to deal with. But giving feedback, I wrote the question is, when simply trying to give feedback to a subordinate. Well, I don't know if there's ever been a time where feedback is a simple thing to do, but when you have a subordinate who doesn't seem to be receptive or is pushing back, how do you approach those conversations?
I would ask the leader in that situation, what is the goal of that feedback? Because again, that goes back to the goals, because the goal of making somebody feel happy about getting constructive feedback, that's not a good goal. If you tell me that everything I've been doing is wrong or one thing I've been doing is wrong and I need to fix it or I might get a warning, I don't know, anybody that's going to be happy in this situation. Like, oh, thanks. I'm so happy that I got this feedback and I'm not doing well at my job. So really it's thinking through, do you need them to be happy about this? Right? Or do you need them to just do something differently? Right? I think that's the first thing to think about. It's not that you're purposely trying to make them unhappy or you're trying to like yell at them. It's really just thinking through, how important is it that they're happy about this situation? And how realistic it is that they can be happy about this?
I love the outcome focus, because I think there's been a lot of times throughout my military career, or just throughout being when I'm a leader in charge of someone, where I want to say something, I want to give feedback, but then I think through like, okay, is this actually going to change anything? Or, what's the actual outcome here? And I think I learned this later in my career than earlier. Earlier, I just give everyone feedback, and I think I came off as a jerk. But as you think through a little bit later in my career, I started like, okay, is this actually going to change any behaviors? And so I think having that mind shift change was really important in my growth.
I've had leaders tell me like that it changed their entire approach just by writing the goal on top of a piece of paper when they go into these conversations with the staff. So when a staff tries to go off topic, they try to go on tangents or blame other people or talk about this issue or that issue, because they wrote it down, they're like, yes, I get it. I get that's important to you. Let's talk about that after. I want to make sure we cover this first. And they feel much more confident because they just know, I need to tell you this feedback. I need to change your behavior in this way first. And then we could talk about those other things that are bothering you. And then we could have that coaching conversation or that supportive conversation around, how do I support you in doing that? Maybe you do need more support, and let's help you think through how I can support you. But first is, I need you to know what needs to be different going forward.
And let me just see if I heard something there, Chris, where you talked a coaching conversation versus a supporting conversation. Are you distinguishing a difference there?
No, sorry. I'm not trying to distinguish. I just think that some people, I want them to think about them the same way. Like, coaching is not necessarily like coaching somebody through an error. It's also like, I'm supporting you through that error or supporting you through your performance, your work here.
My last scenario here, Chris, is whether it's with a difficult person, whether it's dealing with organizational change, whether it's giving feedback or any of the other hundreds of difficult conversations a manager might have to have. If you are working in a remote or hybrid work environment and these conversations are occurring virtually, what becomes your advice then?
I think it's being really, especially if it's the harder the conversation, needs to be on video, not in person, but on video. You need to see those nonverbals. And I think it helps a lot if you can have more frequent check-ins or conversations with that person. That helps a lot, because if you just have a one and done, that's going to leave a sour taste. You're going to see them every day. You're going to see them in the hallway. You're going to see them go into the bathroom, get a drink, get food, whatever. Or you might say, talk about the weather, right? Like, people used to make fun of those kind of conversations, like the water cooler talk, or like those nonsensical things. But really, those things build a rapport over time. They're really like these small rapport building interactions. And you lose that with virtual. And so you need to build that in specifically more so that you can have that relationship and that trusting, so that when I talk to you and give you that feedback, it's not just coming out of nowhere, but we've had enough interaction that I trust you, or we have a good rapport that I know that you're looking out for me. You're not just randomly throwing bad news my way.
Chris, as a father of two, a business owner, and a podcast host, you juggle many leadership roles. Have your experiences as a parent influenced how you approach coaching and leadership development, and or vice versa?
I think parenting negotiation conversations are probably the hardest, because you have an irrational person that's refusing to negotiate with you. I think of, what is that movie? The Negotiator with Samuel L. Jackson and Kevin Spacey. Love that movie. And Kevin Spacey's character is supposed to be like one of the best negotiators in the city. And at the beginning of the movie, his character is introduced by trying to negotiate with his teenage daughter. And he just loses that conversation, right? And I think that's true. Like, how can you really rationally negotiate with a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old that's refusing to put on a jacket, or a 3-year-old that's refusing to put on their shoes? And so I think that's given me much more, and like really all the work I've done helps me understand, like, oh, I know why they're doing this. It doesn't make it easier. It doesn't make me more calm, But I get it. They're anxious about something, or they have a stomach ache, or they're socially anxious if they're in public, right? I get it. I understand why they're doing this. It doesn't make it easier. And I think it just makes it easier for me to recognize those things in everyday life. Also, now it's easier for me to recognize, oh, you're just nervous about this other thing, or I'm wondering, or it looks like you're nervous about this other thing. Let's explore that for a little bit. What's going on here for you? But it just makes me better at just kind of recognizing that there's lots of things going on for somebody.
Yeah, I love that, especially as you think about I don't know how old your kids are, Chris, but mine range from 6 to 17. What I'm in the midst of learning, and this is a multi-year process, is what was working when they were 5, 6, and 7 is not working at 15, 16, and 17. And those conversations, the skills around those conversations are actually a little different, what I have to do. And so I find it helpful because the world is filled with a lot of different people, and what might work here might need to be adjusted there.
Yeah. My kids are 8 and 3, and it's always a new learning journey every day.
Well, Chris, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I know we've barely scratched the surface of kind of everything you do. I'm curious about, what haven't we asked you today that you would like to share and leave with our audience as kind of a final piece of advice for mastering difficult conversations?
I would say the only thing that I didn't talk about, I think you probably did ask this, I didn't cover this for whatever reason, is learning to master ourselves emotionally. I think that's a really key skill, is learning how to master ourselves. And I don't mean just like the negative emotions, right? Like anger, frustration, anxiety. Yes, we should learn how to ground ourselves, have something we can do to keep ourselves calm in hard situations. I mean, even the positive feelings as well. I think we've all been in situations where we're like, the conversation seems to be going better than we expected. And so we're like happy, and we're so excited that we like miss signs that we should be paying more attention to, or we overlook kind of little yellow flags that the other person might not be truthful, but we're so happy because everything seems to be going smoother than we anticipated, and then we miss things. And so it's really about how do we maintain that balance and stay focused on what's happening and not be overridden by our emotions in these kind of conversations, because it's really about how do we manage ourselves so that we can help manage the other person in the conversation.
I like that focus.
I'm an entrepreneur like yourself, Chris, and so whenever I'm starting to make a sale and I think it's going in a good direction, I'm overly confident. I'm like starting to celebrate, and I miss those things that I probably could have prevented the sale from going south. So I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I just think we don't talk about those positive feelings that can have. We have to just be cautious, be aware of where, and you said, overconfidence bias can be a product of almost being, not thinking through, not being, not scrutinizing enough and not doing our due diligence. And so I appreciate that as a framework.
Yeah.
Chris, thanks so much. I know you're busy. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We encourage folks to go listen to Chris's podcast as well. There's so many good things out there. Listen to it. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for all the work that you are doing in the field.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. It was a cool conversation.
Well, that is it for us on today's podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx Podcast if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next episode.